I stood outside my son's house on my grandson's birthday. He blocked the doorway and said, "Dad, wait outside. This party is for family only." This winter was colder than usual. The wind cut across my face like a knife. But the cold outside was nothing compared to Desmond's words. My son, the child I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. He stood there leaning against the expensive oak door. A glass of red wine rested in his hand. He looked at me with unfamiliar eyes. The suit he wore was elegant. I recognized the gold cufflinks on his sleeves. They were the gift I had given him when he received his promotion. Now that same arm was pushing me away. "Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, a snack, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to." Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. The story begins inside the mansion. Soft lo-fi music filled the air. Wealthy guests laughed and chatted warmly. I could hear the footsteps of Lachlan, my 8-year-old grandson, running through the house. I could smell the strawberry cake, the cake I had stood in line to buy since 5 o'clock that morning. The box felt heavy in my hands. The red ribbon had begun to soak through with rain. Desmond glanced at it. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his face. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. He said my presence embarrassed him in front of his wife's family. His father-in-law was a wealthy millionaire. I was only a retired schoolteacher wearing a worn-out coat. He had forgotten where the executive chair he sat in had come from. He had forgotten who had paid for the scars of his past mistakes. People often choose to forget a constant once they discover a new variable with greater value. To Desmond, I was a constant that no longer served any purpose. I did not argue. I looked directly into his eyes. His arrogance was important data. I took note of that data. Then I turned and walked away. The door slammed shut behind me. Decisive. Cruel. The sound of the lock echoed through the night. I walked down the granite steps. The snow began falling harder. I did not throw away the cake. I carried it back to my empty house. Desmond's calculation looked perfect on paper, but he had forgotten one thing. Every balanced equation demands a price when one side is wounded. I pulled out my phone. The screen showed no new notifications. I smiled. My silence has always been the beginning of an appropriate punishment. Desmond thought he had won when he closed that door. He had no idea that with his own hands he had just triggered a chain of consequences that could never be reversed. That night I sat down at my desk. I opened my blue notebook. At 11:47 p.m., my phone began exploding with 98 missed calls. 98 missed calls. My phone screen kept flashing in the darkness. A faint blue glow illuminated the strings of numbers. Desmond was panicking. I knew that very well, but I did not swipe the screen to answer. I set the phone back down on the desk face down. Silence is a language that weighs 1,000 pounds. Especially when the person on the other end of the line knows they have made a mistake that cannot be undone. I turned on the old yellow desk lamp. The room filled with a still, quiet light. In front of me lay a blue leather notebook. Its spine had worn thin with time. This was not an emotional diary filled with personal feelings. To me, it was a data archive. Documentation is not revenge. It is evidence of a pattern. In mathematics, an event that happens once may be random. Twice may be unusual. But when it repeats for the 14th time, it becomes a systematic error. It becomes a pattern of betrayal. I turned the pages one by one. The soft rustle of paper echoed through the silent night. Each page marked a point in time. Each point in time was a financial and emotional indictment. I reread the lines written in my own hand. The pain was gone. All that remained was the cold objectivity of a teacher grading a problem that had been wrong from the beginning. November 14th, 2022. Desmond hosted a housewarming party for his first mansion. I brought a Chinese evergreen and wished him peace and prosperity. He told me to leave the plant in a corner of the backyard because he was afraid it would ruin the feng shui design of the living room. March 12, 2024. His wedding anniversary celebration. My name was not on the guest list. Desmond texted me and said the party was only for business partners. September 20th, 2025. I was hospitalized with acute chest pain. The doctor needed a family member to sign the consent forms. I called Desmond 3 times. He did not answer. The next day, he sent a short message. He said he was busy signing a $2 million contract. He said I could take care of myself because I still had health insurance. 14 times. 14 coordinates on a graph showing the decline of morality. Desmond thought his lies were clever. He thought I was a forgetful old man who could easily be fooled by excuses about being busy. But he forgot that I was a mathematician. I do not look at words. I look at the frequency and nature of the data. My son's coldness did not happen in a single day. It was an exponential function tied to the growth of the wealth in his bank account. As his income increased, the value of his father in his eyes decreased in inverse proportion. The phone vibrated again, the 99th time. Desmond was trying to reconnect an equation that had already broken apart. He was beginning to realize that one side of the problem was changing. The white envelope I had given him before leaving was not a desperate letter from a rejected father. Inside that envelope was a piece of information capable of overturning the entire upper-class life he was trying to build. He wanted to know what I was holding. He wanted to know why a retired old school teacher could make his millionaire father-in-law turn pale at the mention of his name. I looked at the blue notebook. I looked at the phone still vibrating across the desk. Desmond still believed this was nothing more than an old man's emotional outburst. He did not yet understand that when a teacher has closed the gradebook, every explanation becomes meaningless. I stood up and opened the old safe in the corner of the room. There was no gold or silver inside. Only a thick file dating back to 2020. The year Desmond had come to his knees before me begging for a lifeline. The file rested neatly in my hands. The papers had faded to a pale yellow over the years. I flipped through receipt copies and checks stamped and verified by the bank. The memories of that year came rushing back immediately. It had been a year of upheaval. It was the moment when the equation of Desmond's life had nearly collapsed to zero. That year, Desmond threw himself into business like a moth rushing toward a flame. He pooled together his money and started a technology distribution company. But the market froze. Supply chains broke down. Business partners walked away. He found himself standing on the edge of bankruptcy. One night in the middle of a torrential rainstorm, Desmond came running to my house. He no longer carried the arrogance he wore today with a glass of wine in his hand. He dropped to his knees on my living room floor, his knees pressed into the old worn carpet. He cried desperately. He said that if he could not come up with $370,000 within 48 hours, he would face prison because of debt and insolvency. He would lose everything. $370,000. For an old math teacher, it was an enormous amount of money. It was every dollar I had received from selling the ancestral home left to me in the suburbs. It was my entire retirement savings accumulated over 35 years of teaching. Desmond looked at me with pleading eyes. He promised to repay every cent. He promised to take care of me when I grew old and weak. I did not hesitate. I did not create a balance sheet to determine whether I would profit or lose. That is what fathers do. We do not ask whether the price is fair. We only ask whether the equation works. My calculation at the time was very simple. On one side stood my entire life savings. On the other stood my son's future and his honor. I chose the second side. I signed the paperwork to withdraw my retirement funds in a lump sum. I sold the piece of family land filled with memories. I transferred the entire $370,000 into Desmond's account. I willingly moved into this cramped rental apartment. Desmond took that money and soared. He saved his company. He met Wallace Ashford. He married Simone. He stepped into high society. He began buying mansions and trading up to luxury cars. But as his net worth increased, he began performing a different calculation on the past. He searched for ways to reduce the value of the debt he owed. He started treating that $370,000 as an obvious obligation any father should have fulfilled. He forgot that the money had not fallen from the sky. It was sweat. It was sacrifice. It was an entire lifetime spent standing at a classroom chalkboard. I ran my hand across the old file. Numbers do not lie. Desmond believed he had repaid his debt with a few inexpensive holiday gifts. He thought a father's sacrifice could be assigned a cash value and then erased from the ledger. But he was wrong. The nature of a debt never truly disappears. It only changes from one form into another. Desmond forgot an extremely important detail from that rainy night. When he received the money, he was in too much of a hurry. He signed a stack of documents that my best friend and I had prepared. He never carefully read the attached terms. He had no idea that behind those $370,000 a legal trap had already been activated. That trap was called Clause 14. I set down the file from 2020. Then I pulled out a document bearing an official red seal across its pages. It was the formal loan agreement. It had been drafted by attorney Thaddeus. Thaddeus had been my university classmate. He was a specialist in corporate financial law, a man with a cold mind and the precision of a computer. That night, Desmond signed this document without the slightest hesitation. He was overwhelmed with relief at having the money that would save him. He flipped through the pages in seconds. He signed every blank line blindly. All he saw was the $370,000 that was about to be deposited into his account. He never noticed the hidden variable buried on page 11. That variable was Clause 14. In the world of financial attorneys, provisions like this are known as hidden nuclear weapons. Thaddeus had foreseen Desmond's ingratitude. He understood the psychology of people who become wealthy too quickly. When people reach the top, they often want to erase the traces of those who lifted them out of the mud. Thaddeus once told me that a father's love was a constant in my heart, but for Desmond it was a variable that could change according to greed. We needed an insurance equation. Clause 14 was very clear. The $370,000 was not a non-refundable gift. It was a convertible loan carrying a penalty interest rate if repayment was overdue by more than 5 years. The contract deadline was October 31, 2025. Today was already 2026. Desmond was more than 6 months past due. What was the consequence of that default? Desmond had absolutely no idea. He believed that at worst I would demand the return of the $370,000 plus a little bank interest. He owned a company worth millions of dollars. He had a luxurious mansion and wealthy friends. He was confident he had enough money to throw in my face if I pushed the matter too far. But mathematics does not work that simply. Clause 14 stated that if the borrower violated the repayment deadline, the entire principal balance and penalty interest would automatically be converted into direct ownership shares of Desmond's company, not at its current market value, but at the book valuation from 2020 when his company had been worth almost nothing. That meant I was not demanding money. I was demanding ownership. According to Thaddeus's precise calculations, the original $370,000 from 2020 combined with the accumulating penalty interest over the past 6 months was now equivalent to 49% of the controlling shares in Desmond's company. I was about to become the largest shareholder, the person holding the power of life and death in the place of which he was most proud. I folded the contract. I placed it inside my old leather briefcase. Tomorrow, Thaddeus would send an official notice to Desmond's office. My son was about to face a test he could never cheat on, but I knew Desmond was not alone in this game. Behind his arrogance stood the shadow of Wallace Ashford, his father-in-law, a true old fox of the financial world. Wallace had taught Desmond how to dismiss and look down on this poor old father. But Wallace did not know that he had accidentally pushed his own son-in-law into an exponential function of destruction, and Wallace himself had already become a factor within its range. Wallace Ashford. In the business world, he was a true hunter, a man who believed that everything in life could be assigned a cash value. When Desmond married Simone Wallace's daughter, he looked at me with open disdain. He looked at my worn-out coat. He looked at the old car I drove. He told Desmond that coming from a poor family of educators was a weakness on his professional profile. He taught my son to use shame as a tool to sever his connection to the past. Desmond learned quickly. He began dodging his debt. He ignored the Friday evenings when he was supposed to make payments toward the principal he owed me. He started following his father-in-law's advice, channeling all available cash flow into a massive $2.1 million deal. This deal was supposed to be the launching pad that would take his company public. Wallace promised to invest if Desmond could demonstrate the decisiveness of a true executive. Ironically, that decisiveness turned out to be pushing his father out of the equation of his life. Greed always operates as an exponential function. When people have 1, they want 10. When they have 10, they want 100. Desmond believed he was controlling the game, but he forgot that I was a teacher. I do not merely look at the answers on a test. I look at how those answers were obtained. Last week, through several former students who now work in auditing, I obtained a set of internal documents. Desmond was deceiving investors. To qualify for Wallace's $2.1 million deal, he had falsified financial statements. He had inflated the previous quarter's revenue to 3 times its actual amount. This was no longer an ordinary error. This was securities fraud, a criminal offense. I sat alone in the dark room, turning page after page of the falsified documents signed by my own son. Disappointment rose inside me like a stream of icy water. I had taught him how to solve difficult problems. I had never taught him how to manipulate the answers. Desmond was standing at the top of a house of cards. One gentle gust of wind would bring down his entire career, reputation, and luxurious lifestyle. Wallace Ashford believed he was the apex predator in this deal. He believed he was leading Desmond by the nose and preparing to swallow his company whole. But neither of them knew one critical piece of information. The contract containing Clause 14 that I held carried greater legal authority than any of their current investment agreements. My 49% ownership stake granted me complete veto power over this $2.1 million transaction. Tomorrow morning, when the market opens, Desmond will submit his listing application. He believes it will be the most glorious day of his life. But he has no idea that an unpredictable witness has just entered the equation. A young witness, one who possesses a missing piece capable of detonating the entire media bomb before I ever have to use the law. Desmond and Wallace believed they had carefully calculated every angle. They controlled the cash flow. They controlled the media. They controlled the investors. But they could not control an 8-year-old child. My grandson, Lachlan. That afternoon, while I stood outside the door in the snow and rain, the boy was sitting in the living room. He was holding a newly purchased iPad. He was testing its audio filtering feature by recording a video. The expensive oak front door could not block the device's sensitive microphone. The entire conversation between Desmond and me was recorded without missing a single word. Desmond's cold voice, the wind whistling through the crack in the door, his cruel rejection of his elderly father, the cake box soaked by the rain. Every sound was captured in the child's accidental recording. The 8-year-old knew it was wrong, but the 41-year-old man still had not realized it. Lachlan did not fully understand the meaning of his father's words. But he saw his grandfather walk away in the rain. He saw his father slam the door shut in anger. He pressed the save button. After that, the video was automatically backed up to the family's shared iCloud account. It was an automatic synchronization feature, a simple algorithm with no emotions. It merely performed its task of copying data from one device to another. At 11 o'clock that night, Simone, Desmond's wife, opened her computer to review photos from their son's birthday party. Instead of cheerful photographs, the screen displayed Lachlan's 30-second video. Simone sat frozen at her vanity table. She was not greedy like Wallace. She was a mother. She understood the meaning of family bonds. The naked truth revealed in the clip sent a chill through her. The man she had lived with for 10 years was far colder than she had ever imagined. Simone began questioning everything. She questioned the origin of the $370,000 that had saved the company during its crisis years earlier. She questioned why Desmond always found ways to avoid the subject whenever she suggested inviting me over to visit. The data had been exposed, and it created a deep crack in Simone's confidence and trust. At the same time, I also received a copy on my phone. I sat and watched the video play across the screen. I was not angry. I knew that what was meant to come would come. I turned off the phone. I placed the contract containing Clause 14 into a pristine white envelope. I included no note. Not a single word. I sent it by overnight courier to Desmond's office that very night. My son believed that tomorrow would be the day he reached the pinnacle of glory with his $2.1 million deal. He had no idea that when he walked into his office, a brutal financial autopsy would be waiting for him on his desk. Late at night. The lights were still on in Desmond's office on the 34th floor. He sat alone in front of the gleaming glass windows, looking down at the city flooded with headlights and neon lights. Tomorrow was the big day. The day his company would officially go public. Everything had been scheduled perfectly. He should have been celebrating with Wallace, but a bad feeling kept him from leaving the office. At 11:47 p.m., the white envelope I had sent by overnight courier was sitting on his desk. The building security guard had delivered it about 10 minutes earlier. Desmond stared at the envelope. There was no sender's name, only the seal of Thaddeus's law firm. He used a silver letter opener to slice it open. Inside was not an emotional letter of disappointment from an elderly father. Inside was a financial autopsy. It was a 20-page document. The first page was a summary of the loan from 2020. The figure of $370,000 was printed in bold black ink. Desmond turned to the next page. The color began draining from his face. The numbers seemed to dance before his eyes. Accumulating penalty interest. 6 months of delinquency. And finally Clause 14 quoted in full with his own signature beneath it. Desmond frantically flipped to the last page. There he found the share conversion calculation prepared by Thaddeus, 49% ownership of the company. Complete control over the current board structure resting in my hands. The $2.1 million deal with Wallace Ashford instantly became worthless paper without my approval and signature. The falsified financial report he was preparing to submit to the stock exchange had also been attached by Thaddeus as supporting evidence, along with a stern warning regarding securities fraud. Sweat began rolling down Desmond's forehead. He grabbed the phone on his desk. His hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped it. He dialed my number. The first call. The ringtone echoed through my empty apartment. I watched the screen light up but did not answer. The second call. The 10th. The 50th. Then 98 missed calls. He knew I was looking at the phone. He knew I was deliberately remaining silent. The silence of a teacher, while a student realizes that he solved the test incorrectly from the very first step. There is no opportunity to correct a paper that has already been turned in. He finally realized that the worn coat of the father he had thrown out earlier that afternoon was now the very thing capable of taking away the entire kingdom he possessed. If you've followed the story this far, then you may be finding it interesting. Please do us a quick favor. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and predict how the story will end to see if your guess is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Desmond could no longer sit still. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office. He needed to find Wallace Ashford. His millionaire father-in-law was the only lifeline he could think of. He believed Wallace's power and money could crush an old school teacher and an aging attorney, but Desmond did not know that Wallace was holding another document in his hands. A document capable of stripping away my entire pension and driving me into ruin. This confrontation had just evolved into a new equation, one far more complicated than before. 8 o'clock the next morning. Attorney Thaddeus's office was filled with the light of the morning sun. But the atmosphere inside was ice cold. Wallace Ashford sat arrogantly on a leather sofa. Desmond stood quietly behind him. His face looked exhausted after a sleepless night. Wallace showed no sign of panic. He wore a smug smile. He placed a thin file on the glass table. Wallace looked at me with the eyes of a man who believed himself superior. He said that my 49% ownership stake was an impressive number. But mathematics only has value when a person still has the right to remain in the game. He pushed the file toward me. Inside was a report from the IRS. Wallace had used his influence to dig for flaws. He had discovered an error in my tax records from 3 years earlier. An amount of income from private tutoring had not been fully reconciled. The figure was $22,000. Wallace threatened me. He said that if I did not sign an agreement surrendering my 49% ownership stake for $0, he would submit the document to the IRS. I would face a criminal tax investigation. The remainder of my pension would be frozen. The honor of a teacher with 35 years of service would disappear into nothing. Wallace believed he had found a variable capable of completely eliminating my equation. He was betting on an old school teacher's lack of understanding of complicated financial regulations. Desmond looked at me. A cruel spark of hope flashed in his eyes. He thought his father-in-law had won. He thought my worn-out coat would once again be forced to bow before the power of money. I looked at the tax file. I was not afraid. A good teacher is never surprised by a trick question from a troublesome student. I turned toward Thaddeus. Thaddeus smiled slightly and opened his leather briefcase. He placed an original receipt on the table bearing the red seal of the United States Treasury. November 10, 2023. It was a receipt for a voluntary supplemental tax payment. 3 years earlier, Thaddeus himself had discovered the $22,000 discrepancy while helping me complete the paperwork for selling my house. I had voluntarily paid the penalty and settled the entire amount, including late payment interest, long before Wallace had ever learned of its existence. My tax record was completely clean. Wallace's counterattack failed completely. The arrogant expression on his face immediately twisted. The smile vanished from his lips. The documents in his hands had become nothing more than a harmless joke. He had calculated an equation using outdated and inaccurate data. Desmond completely fell apart. He realized that his only lifeline had just exploded. But that was not all. Thaddeus stood up. He produced an official ultimatum. If Desmond did not sign the transfer order for the 49% ownership stake before noon today, we would submit his falsified financial statements to the Securities Commission. The office door suddenly swung open. Simone walked in. In her hand was her son's iPad. There was not a trace of affection left in her eyes as she looked at Desmond. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The snowstorm outside had stopped, but the cold still lingered throughout my cramped rental apartment. There was a knock at the door. Hesitant, uncertain, I opened it. Desmond stood there. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His normally well-groomed hair hung across his forehead. His eyes were red from panic and despair. He had not come with Wallace. Wallace had abandoned him the moment he realized the $2.1 million deal had turned into a financial black hole. Desmond stepped inside. He looked around the simple apartment. He looked at the old particle board dining table. Then he dropped to his knees once again. Just like that rainy night in 2020. He cried. He begged me to sign the waiver agreement for the Securities Commission. He said that if I did not save him, he would lose everything. Simone was filing for divorce and seeking custody of their son. The company would collapse. He would go to prison. I did not say a word. I walked into the small kitchen. I turned on the gas stove. A blue flame sprang to life. I placed a small pot of water on the burner. Then I took out 2 packages of inexpensive instant noodles. The same meal we had eaten throughout the years when he was a struggling college student. Back then, I always gave him the only meatballs in the bowl. Desmond watched me cook. The sound of boiling water filled the suffocating silence. I placed 2 steaming bowls of noodles on the table. I pushed one toward him. I told him to eat. Desmond stared at the bowl. Tears dripped into the broth. He said he was in no state of mind to eat noodles right now. Calmly, I picked up my chopsticks. I told him that an empty mind cannot solve difficult problems. If you want to correct a mistake, you must first be clear-headed enough to see where the error lies. I looked at my guilty son. My heart tightened, but my face remained as calm as a teacher standing at the front of a classroom. Punishment does not change people. Understanding does. I was not using Clause 14 to destroy him, nor was I submitting his falsified financial reports to the authorities. If I did that, I would only be proving that I was successful at revenge. But I was a father. I was a teacher. My goal was to correct the mistakes on his exam, not tear the exam paper apart. I pushed the share conversion documents toward Desmond. I told him I would sign an order freezing the 49% ownership stake in order to protect the company's assets from creditors. I would save him from prison. But on one condition. He had to personally submit his resignation as chief executive officer. He had to solve this debt problem himself, starting from the most basic numbers. He had to relearn how to be an honest human being before learning how to be a millionaire. Desmond looked at me in shock. He was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the punishment. I was not taking away his money. I was taking away the arrogance that had blinded him for so many years. He picked up the pen. His hand trembled as he signed the resignation agreement. He had chosen to face the error in his life. Desmond left my home after night had fallen. He walked away carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders, but his steps were steadier than before. The lesson had been learned. The equation now had a new path toward a solution. But just as I was about to close the door, my phone received a message from Thaddeus. A final development had just been recorded at the county property registration office. Simone had made an extreme decision that even surprised me. Simone's decision came as a great surprise. She used her entire share of the assets from the divorce settlement to fully repay the original $370,000 debt to me. She did not want her son to grow up carrying the shame of having a father who refused to repay what he owed. Simone's action officially reduced the debt side of the equation to 0. 6 months later, this year's winter was finally coming to an end. Warm spring sunlight began filtering through the windows. Today was Sunday. I stood by the window of my apartment looking down at the walkway below the building. The path had been cleared of snow and carefully salted to prevent slipping. That was something Desmond had quietly been doing for the past 3 months. Every Sunday morning, before I woke up, he no longer drove luxury cars. He wore simple work clothes. The arrogance he once carried had disappeared. In its place were calmness and patience. A knock sounded at the door. Exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I opened it. Desmond stood there with Simone and my grandson Lachlan. They carried a basket of fruit and ingredients for dinner. There were no formal pleasantries, no expensive glasses of wine, and no upper-class pretenses. Desmond looked at me. The sincerity he had lost 10 years ago had returned to his eyes. He lowered his head respectfully. He called me Dad with genuine respect. Our first Sunday dinner after so many storms passed in a warm and peaceful atmosphere. At last, the equation of our lives had found a balanced solution. Desmond had accepted a fresh start at a small company in an ordinary employee position. Self-respect does not come from winning. It comes from how you fight. I watched my son correct the mistakes in his life, one by one. For a father, that was the greatest reward. Understanding had healed the wounds left by betrayal. Thank you for joining Dad's real-life revenge. Don't forget to share your story in the comments and click like and subscribe so you won't miss the next valuable lesson. I want to leave you with one thought. In life, money and status are only temporary variables. They come and go with the changing tides of time. Only family bonds and personal integrity remain true constants. Never erase from your life the people who sacrificed everything to lift you out of the mud simply because of numbers in a bank account. Every moral error carries a cost, and every error in character will eventually be balanced by a harsh equation of cause and consequence.